Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Wakabayashi and you're listening to Yellow Glitter, Mindfulness Through the Eyes and Soul of a Gay Asian. This episode we're joined by another awesome queer Asian voice, Amazin Lêthi. Amazin Lêthi is an Athlete Ally and Stonewall sports ambassador, former competitive bodybuilder, entertainment executive, and the first Vietnamese internationally published fitness author. Through her personal journey of homelessness, she founded the Amazin LeThi Foundation. Amazin has shared her story for It Gets Better campaign and the first White House initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders Asian anti-bullying campaign, Act to Change. She has been recognized by GLAAD and NQAPIA for her LGBTQ advocacy. She was the first Asian LGBTQ athlete in 2020 to be honored at the Brooklyn Nets' 4th annual Pride Night, and she has been listed in the Australian Pride Power List, Out 100 List, Go Magazine 100 Women We Love List, 2020 Global Changemakers, and acknowledged in the Human Rights Campaign Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month Honors List. Hi, Amazin. So glad to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Stephen. It's such a pleasure to be on the show with you today.
It's quite a bio that you had, and it's just, you've accomplished so much in the span of your lifetime so far. And before we get into the podcast, diving into all that you've done, I just wanted to check in with you. Just how are you doing right now, given the current climate, COVID, everything that's happening?
You know, I think like everyone, it's been really challenging, COVID and the pandemic, because, you know, how do you prepare for a pandemic? There was no, any 101 manual that you bought from Barnes and Nobles, and no one, saw this coming. And, I've been very frank and upfront that, like so many of us, my mental health has been very, up and down. I've had good days. I've had not so good days. And it's, just to know that that's okay, because, many of us, have felt very isolated from, having to social distance, not being near friends or relatives or loved ones, and just the whole change of how it's changed the world. And when I think of, how I'm doing, I think of, which I know we'll get into, the LGBT youth homelessness, because I used to be homeless, but to be homeless in a pandemic is, obviously taking it to the next level. But I do what I can for my mental health in terms of making sure that I exercise regularly, staying connected with, friends and loved ones via Zoom, making sure that I'm meditating every day and doing a lot of self-care, because I think that's so important, and just making sure that I turn off technology every day, because the news at the moment, if it's not about the administration, it's about how many deaths, it's about the COVID, it's about world crisis, and I think that's just not good consumption for your mind constantly. So, I take a lot of time when I just turn off all technology and just listen to classical music.
Yeah, those are amazing recommendations. And I think turning off is so important, because what is being blasted on the news is really just to stir up our emotions. They want us to tune in, and they want us to feel angry, outraged, sad, anxious, and at least for myself, I found myself getting stuck on social media. They call this doom scrolling. Have you heard of it before?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. The term doom scrolling, where you scroll through your feed to see pretty much, all these things that are just hurting you emotionally, making you sad, angry, upset, and just how unhealthy this is, and having to step away so that you can make sure you make space for yourself, prioritize yourself, understand your needs.
And yes, and I kind of have this saying that, you need to constantly stand guard at the door of your mind, because so much is trying to get in. And as you said, it's not healthy. A lot of it is garbage that just fills your mind, and and that can set off anxiety and panic attacks and feeling, and your mental health going up and down. And I've found, particularly during the pandemic, I mean, I was doing it before, but I think particularly so during the pandemic, I try and shut off technology a couple of hours before I sleep, and I put on classical music because it just really starts winding down the mind and just calming down the mind. And I'm doing a lot of audio books. I think that's fantastic for your mind, just kind of lying on the sofa with some classical music in the background and just listening to just like a really nice tranquil audio book, just to kind of set your mood and mind into kind of obviously going to sleep.
Any recommendations of classical music composers and audiobooks that have just been really delightful?
In terms of classical music, I tend to just go on YouTube and just Google meditation classical music. So it's just soft classical music, because there's some classical music, obviously, that has lots of drums and it can be very loud, and it's like you don't want that in the evening because you want your mind to wind down. I think one of my favorite authors right now is Brené Brown. I really love her take in terms of, to be brave, you must be vulnerable. So she just has some fantastic books around vulnerability and rising strong. And I also do lots of sleep stories, audio sleep stories that just kind of run for about half an hour of, really calming stories, which are really great just to calm the mind, because there's a lot that's gone on within 3 months in the world.
Unlike anything ever before, I also love Brené Brown and her books. At least, if someone is, if you're listening right now and you haven't had a chance to dive into her book, she has this amazing TED Talk on vulnerability that has millions and millions of views. And it's just a really nice way to reframe, I think, vulnerability and what it means for us and how we can use it to empower ourselves, I think is really her message, which is so beautiful. Okay, so let's dive in, shall we?
Yes, let's do it.
Yes. So I was going through your story, and what really fascinated me was your story about your childhood, first starting out growing up in Saigon. And just wanted to ask you, what was your story like from Saigon, and where did you go up next?
So I was left in an orphanage by my mother, and I was adopted by a couple at the time that were living in Australia. So I spent my formative years in Australia in a time where Asian people were just coming into the country. So I lived, what I'm seeing now going on across the US with the Trump administration and the amount of kind of anti-everyone, unless you're like a white cis man, I went through that in Australia, where the government said publicly that they did not want to be Asianized and that they were being invaded by the Asian community like we were aliens. So I encountered, growing up in an all-white background had its very unique challenges. And I think when you speak to any transracial adoptee, and there are many across the US, you do feel like you're living in limbo because you're being brought up in an all-white background that's not part of your culture, but at the same time, you feel very displaced within the Asian community as well. So you're in this kind of limbo land where you don't really fit in anywhere. So I encountered a terrible amount of racism as a child, just constantly. I think I've heard every single Asian slur possible as a kid. And I found that very traumatic, because when you're a child, you can't understand why people hate you so much for being you. And on top of that, being very confused about my sexuality and how I felt inside, and not seeing an Asian person in media, and not ever seeing an LGBTQ person. So I never had the word for how I felt, and I felt very alone in my feelings. Like, I absolutely believed that I was the only Asian person that felt like this, and that I was the only Asian LGBTQ person in the world. And, you know, I think many Asian queer people feel like that, because we just don't have this kind of representation. So our feelings are very singular and very lonely as well. So it's very hard to know who you can become if you don't see yourself. I was bullied at school a lot by school kids. They didn't know that I was part of the LGBTQ community, but they could see something that they can tell that I was different in some way inside. So I got a lot of gay slurs as well, even if they didn't know that I was, but they used it. And, you know, it's very hurtful to a child that's part of the LGBTQ community, that the whole, you know, using the gay word against you as a slur in a very derogatory way. And I didn't really get any support from the teachers either. And I just kind of remember one poignant moment as a child when my teacher made me stand up in front of the entire class, and there would have been about 30 or so kids in the class, and said, "This is what failure looks like." And I would be the kid most likely in life to fail. And I just remember just standing there, and all the kids were laughing at me, and just thinking, I can't cry, and I will never feel this humiliated ever again, and I never want anyone to feel like I have what I've just gone through. And then she made me sat down, and then I sat down, and then the kids were still laughing at me, and then she threw a blackboard eraser, and the wooden bit I just remember it just hitting me at my head, and just kind of thinking that I can't understand why the world is so against me. Like, people hate Asians at the same time. I'm like the biggest failure in the world. And so I never had any role models or any kind of mentor. I had to somehow pull my strength from myself, which was very difficult. And I didn't really have that many friends, so I would literally go to the library and cry, but then spend time in the library reading. It was about, you know, different people in life. And, you know, I read extensively about Walt Disney and, you know, about Colonel Sanders. And so they became my mentors, people that were quite different and had these amazing dreams and were able to do, you know, the impossible. So I kind of lived out my world through this kind of fantasy realm. And I went into sports quite early on in life as well. And I think, you know, as a kid, when you're kind of awkward and you don't feel like you fit in, you're always trying to find a sense of community. So I went into team sports as a kid, but I just found that the racism and bullying followed me there, because I was then the only Asian kid in sports. And I could see then quite clearly and quite quickly how then the athletic community saw Asian kids. So I got a lot of bullying from my teammates, from other teams, my coach. I loved sprinting, and I wasn't the fastest, but I still loved it. And I just remember my coach pulling me aside and saying, you know, Asian kids are geeky, we're slow, you know, we don't have very long limbs. And sprinting, he said, you know, so sprinting's not for you. I think you should try long distance running, because that's where Asian kids fit better, because we're just slow and geeky. So I went into that, and I was actually pretty good at it, but I also enjoyed it because it was more of an individual sport, whereas sprinting, I had to be part of a team. But I still got bullied a lot. And it was just very unusual, and I just fell into bodybuilding. I had some dumbbells around the house that I just started using because I didn't really feel like the sports that I got, team sports wasn't really working for me because I was bullied a lot, and I just didn't feel like it gave me the self-worth and the self-confidence that I needed, and also the strength to stand up to those that bullied me. So I just started, must have been like 6 or 7 when I started weight training.
Wow.
And I loved it. I had no idea what I was doing, but I just loved, I remember just standing in my bedroom doing like 100 repetitions of dumbbell curls and thinking this is the greatest.
I did not do that when I was 6 or 7. Let me tell you. I was playing with
I was a very unusual child. Yeah. But I just saw my body physically changing, and I felt stronger, and my self-worth changed. And, I started going to the gym when I was about 8 or so. And then I was suddenly thrust from kids' sport to the adult sports. And I had no idea what I was putting myself in for, or what it was going to be like at the gym. In my mind, I probably thought there'd be like kids like myself at the gym.
No.
And so I got there and found an all-white, male-dominated adult sport. Yeah. Very misogynistic, very sexist, that whole kind of Trump locker room talk. And, I was there invading their space, and they didn't know how to handle this Asian female kid, walking in for the first time. And I encountered a terrible amount of misogyny and sexism to my face and behind my back while I was still in their space. And you have to realize that, I'm only like 8 at the time, and these men are saying these horrible sexist, misogynistic things to my face. And, I don't know what to say to that, but I knew it sounded wrong. But I loved the sport and what it did for me, and it was an individual sport, and I thought, I have to stand my ground because this is something that I love. And I did, and, I would spend a lot of time in the reception reading the bodybuilding magazines like Flex and Muscle and Fitness. And there was just like this one person who kept coming up all the time whenever I read a magazine, which was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I really latched onto him. And I think for me, it was more this premise of someone who had a funny accent, who had a funny name, came from a strange place and looked very different, but used sports as a platform to get somewhere in life, to make an impact in the world, and obviously to have this amazing career that he had. So I spent all my time reading about him, and he became this mentor to me that I could somehow use bodybuilding and sport as my platforms for change and to, see the world. And then I started competing as a teenager. And that was very strange because I was the only Asian teen competing. And I really challenged people's perception of Asian women. And I think now still, we still have this perception that Asian women are very passive, we're geisha-like, we're very subservient. So that was challenging for people because here I was being, very strong and muscular and standing up for myself because I had to in the gym. I think, spending all my time when, kids my age were bonding with other girls, I was bonding with adult men. So I kind of gained these very unique kind of, I suppose, masculine skills. Like when I think of myself now, I'm able to walk into a room full of men and command the stage and know how to present myself because I've been doing it, since I was a child. So I competed for a period of time, and I think people found me very much of a novelty factor because I was so different, but at the same time kind of didn't know where to place me. And I started to, like Arnold, I kind of read of, how he used sport as a platform to move into the entertainment industry. So I, tried to make that move into the entertainment industry, but I struggled because people just couldn't picture an Asian female bodybuilder in the entertainment industry. And I remember, having an audition with MTV, and they literally just laughed in my face and said, this is never going to happen. No one would ever think of hiring an Asian person for a start, and then an Asian bodybuilder in the entertainment industry. I mean, I never, as I said, I never saw any Asian person on TV. The first Asian person I saw on TV was Dustin Nguyen on 21 Jump Street. And when I remember seeing him, it was just like this revelation that, oh my God, Asian people exist on TV. And that creates the possibility that maybe one day I could work in the industry and be seen on TV. And then I qualified as a strength coach, and I started training other athletes. But I always struggled with my sexuality and just feeling like I was different, because there was a terrible amount of hate in Australia. When I see what's happening in the US around the persecution of Black and brown people, and how white America, has this fear of Black people, but they don't know where it comes from. This was the kind of fear that white Australia had over Asian people, and they didn't know where it came from, but they just were so afraid of us. And, you would hear reports in the paper that, they felt very uncomfortable when they saw Asian kids at the train station because, their life felt threatened. The Vietnamese, we lived in a very bad parts of town, and we were just known as thugs and prostitutes. And that's how I saw myself, as someone that was bad. I never had a good image of an Asian person. And I just remember as a child just feeling so unhappy with myself and spending so much time washing my arms, thinking that I could wash away the Asian, and looking in the mirror and not understanding why people hated me so much and why I felt so different inside. So I held a lot of that pain in for so many years. And then, when I finally left Australia as a late teen, very young adult, and I was kind of traveling between Europe and the US, I think I just literally, it was a time ticking bomb inside of me of all the trauma and all the pain that I held inside. At one point, it was going to explode, but I didn't know when it was. And, and I didn't really have, I only met one gay person in Australia who ended up becoming my best friend, and we're still friends today. But other than that, I didn't really have too much connection with the LGBTQ community. And I think for many of us, we're particularly in the LGBTQ community, we're a paycheck away from poverty and one person away of spiraling out of control and just falling into that bad crowd. And that's what happened to me. I ended up just meeting all these gay people, falling into that bad crowd of drugs and alcohol and partying 24 hours a day. Yeah. And one thing led to another, and I ended up homeless for a number of years, which, became my darkest years.
Wow. What a journey. I kind of want to go back a little bit towards your childhood and ask you, as a transracial adoptee, did your adopted parents, did they know how to deal with racism, adopting an Asian child?
No. Transracial adoption is so complex. And whenever a transracial adoptee speaks up about their experiences, they're usually persecuted by the adopter community for not feeling grateful for the fact that you were adopted,
right? Yes.
and rescued from your poor war-torn country, because we rescued you, and if you weren't rescued, you would live like that. So there's a cycle of making you feel, grateful and, making you feel bad and shaming you for speaking your truth. That's why you find not many transracial adoptees do speak up. And when they do, it's always like roses and everything was fantastic. But we know through research that transracial adoptees have a very high percentage of mental health and suicide rate, because it is so complex, because you're taking someone from another background and making them assimilate into your background. For the most part, you're erasing their culture and their heritage and everything about them, and hoping that they will then be okay in your white background and world. I mean, now you have these transracial camps in the US, and I've been to a few obviously as an adult to share my experience. But still, it's very challenging. I mean, it is very challenging. And I think, when I was adopted, they didn't really know much about transracial adoption. And even now, white parents think they're doing the right thing. But, there's so much research into, you had a life between 0 and 1.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
we know that the trauma and the pain that a baby feels when it's taken away from its mother is cellular. And it's something that lives very deep inside a transracial person. So they couldn't see the racism. And I remember one time when my adopted father took me through the Vietnamese area, and I had my window down because it was summer. And he turned to me and said, "You should wind up your window, because when we get to a traffic light, the Vietnamese people are bad people and they could come in and steal something or grab you."
Wow.
And I just remember there sitting thinking, oh, I'm Vietnamese.
Yeah.
And thinking, what does that mean? You've said that, and what does that mean about me? And so they couldn't, I think they couldn't see the racism. I mean, it's like what we're going through now with the Black Lives Matter movement, and having these, uncomfortable conversations with white America, that when you've lived a life of white privilege and never experienced microaggressions or racism, it does become very hard to live in our shoes of what that means, because as soon as we're born, we are very aware of our presence and we're very aware of the triggers. And you can see this actually, and I think it's becoming very clear with white America over the mask wearing, of why white America is having a meltdown with the mask wearing, because they've never had a trigger before, and this is triggering their privilege that we don't have in that way, because we're not white. So it was very difficult for me to then vocalize the racism that I was going through, and for them to understand it. And it was very normalized within the community, because you would, it'd be like you walking outside now and seeing horrible Asian slurs on all different buildings everywhere, the train station, and outside department stores, and no one taking it down because it was seen as very normal. I remember, where I lived at the time, I had to walk through a tunnel, and every single day I would see these horrible Asian slurs in the tunnel. And as I turned the tunnel, coming out of the tunnel, kids would hide behind that turn and jump out and attack Asian kids. And it always set my heart on fire, knowing that I had to take that turn, and sometimes kids would jump out and do the whole kind of slitty slanty eyes. And I just remember asking the train master once, why don't you paint over the Asian slurs? Because I find it very, hurtful and disturbing. And the train master just said at me, because the next day it's going to be there again, so we can't be bothered anymore. And it became so normalized. So when it becomes, with what we're seeing now in the US, when racism it was always there, but when it becomes normalized from the top, then, you know, people think it's okay to say what they think and to do these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just really curious. Was there ever a turning point for you, especially when it relates to your racial identity, your Asian identity, where you went from possibly seeing yourself as white, right, with white parents, a white community, and really loving your Asian identity? Was there a turning point that happened where you maybe saw something in media or something where you're like, actually, this is me. I actually love being Asian?
You know, and that's a really interesting question because, you know, for a lot of transracial adoptees, and it's really strange experience, and sometimes, you know, it's hard for people who aren't transracial adoptee to get your head around that.
Yeah.
You're brought up white. I was brought up a white racist.
Yeah.
And the people that I surrounded myself with and, you know, the white community didn't actually see my Asianness.
No, they say like you're the different Asian or stuff like that, you know?
Yes, they had raised me completely that it is so strange when I look back at my childhood that it was like I was given this invisible cloak where I would, you know, it's like walking into the room of the Ku Klux Klan as, you know, an Asian or a black person or a Latinx person, and they're still speaking about how they hate Asian people with you in the room but cannot see that you're Asian because somehow society, because you've become this special Asian to them, but because you've lived within their community and you've been brought up white, they don't see you. And it's really bizarre and it's kind of like this odd superpower that I have now as an adult where I can walk into these all white rooms that may be a little uncomfortable, but I can like turn on this superpower where they don't really see me as an Asian person. They see what I was brought up as. But it's also a little strange. You can see in their eyes because they're a little bit confused by that as well, because they're not quite sure how this person is fitting in so well within their community. So, you know, I think, you know, as I started getting older, you know, I think between kind of the sort of, you know, 8 to 12 period, because I started feeling very confused about my identity, that I was brought up white, but at the same time, people are still seeing this Asianness in me. And then when I would look in the mirror, I couldn't understand why I didn't see a white person, but I saw an Asian person. And I remember in one of the living room, there was this poster with a little Asian girl. And I remember as a child, I said, "That's me." And my father at the time saying, "No, that's another Asian girl." And I was so positive that was me because it was like my only reference to another Asian kid. And I just remember spending so much time just looking at this poster and thinking, "That's me," and saying it out loud and thinking it's constantly. I didn't meet a Vietnamese person until I was in my late teens. And the Asian kids that I met, they had come from overseas because their parents had been reassigned to Australia for work. So they always found me a little bit strange because they couldn't understand. They could see that I was quite different, but they couldn't put their finger on it. But they kind of stuck together. So I didn't really spend too much time within the group of, you know, Japanese kids or Chinese kids, but it's mainly Japanese kids because they would just spend a lot of time together. But I think, you know, as I kind of started heading into my teens, I just had this kind of, I think my biggest thought was I just wanted to show the world that Asian people are good people, that I wanted people to understand that we were good people, that we weren't these people that the community and that the media was saying. And I think particularly Vietnamese people, because I couldn't think, for me, it's like we weren't all, I thought to myself, I'm not a prostitute and I'm not a thug, but that's how the community saw us. But it was a very long journey. And I identified as white for a very long time. I could not see any kind of connection in being Asian. And, I think, by the time I started to become a teenager, I thought a lot about the reference points of, where I could find a reference of being Asian. And for me now, I think I've taken a 360 in terms of who I am as an Asian person. But, it's a journey. And I think with what I went through, and I think for people who are transracial adoptees, it's a long journey of discovering yourself. And part of that journey is going back to your motherland as well. Like I always had a very negative thought about Vietnam, because my family told me that if I went back, the communists would kidnap me and I would never leave again. So there was always just this negativity around being Vietnamese and going to Vietnam. And I just remember the first time as a young adult, I went back, and I still remember so clearly in my mind as I could see Saigon in the plane, and it just felt like I was coming home. Like, wow. Yeah. I now know in my mind and my heart that Vietnam is my home, even though obviously I'm very different because I'm, an overseas Vietnamese person, but it's the root where I feel connected to. But even now, it's still, a growing and still a growing experience for myself, because obviously I spend a lot of time in the Asian American community, but I see how different I am because I've lived in different spaces and I've, done very different things. And obviously the experience of Asian Americans is very different from the experience of my experience, but I still feel very obviously connected there.
Yeah, I think the heading home to the motherland is just so powerful. And I think for myself as well, that was a huge turning point for me when I spent considerable time in Asia. I'm half Taiwanese, half Japanese, and then I went and spent a lot of time there a few years ago, actually. And that was a huge turning point for me as well, where I saw a lot of people who look like me. I understood my culture a lot better rather than reading a book about it or using media to identify myself, right? It's how do Japanese people act? Let me look at media to try to understand how, my heritage and ancestry is. And I think, the beauty and the struggle is, the beauty is having Asians return back home really allows them to unlock and understand this cultural identity within themselves. But the sadness is, especially like you mentioned, for transracial adoptees, not just, in Australia, but all around the world, even, most parts of United States, right, that aren't metropolitan cities, they never get that experience for most of their life, their teens and maybe even adulthood, especially looking at the statistics of how many US citizens have passports even, And so I think the beauty of like social media and even this podcast is really allowing other folks to peer into this space that they might not have had experience in. And so, yeah, what you mentioned just totally resonates with me. And I'm just getting goosebumps right now just listening to you.
I mean, for me, going back to my motherland, I know who I am now, but also there's a great deal of sadness inside of me because when I look at Asian families, I think I've never had that. There's a saying, I think, Brené Brown said it very well, that when you're grateful for what you have, you realize the loss that I have, and the loss throughout my life that I've had in terms of just not having that experience of owning my own culture from birth and growing up in it. And, that was very difficult when I went back to Vietnam, because I realized how much of me is Vietnamese in my DNA. And I think, you can take a person out of their country, but you can't take the country out of them. And I've seen so many things that in other Vietnamese women that I do, and I think, oh, wow, it's so entwined within my DNA. But I also see how different I am and how different the Vietnamese have seen me, because I am an overseas Vietnamese, and the struggle with particularly the language of not being able to innately speak your mother tongue, and how important your identity is. And I think that's what it comes down to, particularly when you're Asian and you're LGBTQ, of how important it is for your identity to be recognized and celebrated and loved.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a great segue to talk about, our LGBTQ identity. And question for you, when was the moment that you realized that you were different, not just in the sense of like a racial identity, because that's so obvious, right? That's our skin. But when did you realize that you identified as a part of the LGBTQ community?
I was really young, and it's so true. You're born this way. I must have been, probably 6. I knew I was different at 6, and I just couldn't understand what this difference was inside and why I felt different. And it was very difficult because obviously on compounding on top of that, there was like the racism and bullying that I had to deal with, and constantly not wanting to go to school every single day, but then just feeling so different inside and not having a word for this difference, and not thinking that, at the school as well, thinking that there was no one else like me that felt this way either, and being very confused by the difference. And that carried with me for so many years as a child. And obviously as I grew older, a lot of the school kids picked up on the difference. And I think for many particularly Asian LGBTQ people, because we just don't hear our stories. We don't get the platforms that other communities get. So our pain is so isolating, and it feels so singular. And we, for so long, we don't think that there are other Asian LGBTQ people that feel the way we feel.
Yeah. And because there is a lot of homophobia, anti-LGBTQ sentiments in Asia too, it's usually the butt of a joke, right? If you have this comedy show, the butt of the joke of the comedic sketch is, this person is queer. It's just within the past year, right? The past year or two, we're starting to see legalization and recognition of same-sex marriages, same-sex relationships, most recently in Thailand. And it has been a long time coming. And I think for queer Asians, the difficult part is, do I resonate more with this Western culture, right, that has a lot more acceptance of queer identities, but they are racist towards me? Or do I resonate more with this Asian culture, but is more homophobic, more anti-LGBTQ? than this Western culture. And I think queer Asians sit in between these spectrums of, well, which of the worst do I want to resonate with? And I think it's very taxing. It's very heavy.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, we're not invited into many spaces. So we're always on the outer sphere. And when they talk about the LGBTQ community, it's always white and black. And, we don't have the spaces that other communities have. And if we do, it's always like young Asians, men, and older white men. So, there's that stigma that goes along with it. And I found it very challenging as I was, coming into my own and accepting myself, because when I first went back to Asia, I realized that I was too open for Asian queer people there, because they were all hidden. And then, within the LGBTQ community, there is a tremendous amount of racism that has to be addressed towards Asian LGBTQ community, in the way that I think, the way Asian men are desexualized and the way Asian women are over-sexualized, it carries into the LGBTQ community. But actually it's on a flip, because Asian gay men are very sexualized with white LGBTQ, and Asian women are very desexualized within the, lesbian, queer women's
the community.
Yes, community is quite the opposite. So we don't tend to have a space that we fit in. So it's very challenging if you're then an Asian person struggling with your sexuality and gender identity and taking your first steps into the community and realizing this community hasn't created a space for you to be loved and celebrated. And, for a very long time, I think, why is there a Black pride in every part of the world, but we don't have an Asian pride, a place where Asian queer people can, celebrate themselves? And I think, only recently are we starting to see the increase of Asian LGBTQ people in the media that aren't the stereotype.
Absolutely.
Of, what we have seen in previous years.
Absolutely. And I think also for our community, we're starting to see acceptance of LGBTQ identity that isn't binary, of being gay or being lesbian. And I think it's another hurdle for our community that is already struggling to accept gay and lesbian identities, to start acknowledging the fact that there are folks who identify as queer, non-gender binary, bisexual, trans. And I am very grateful for the spaces that are being created by folks like you and by other leaders in the space that recognize the need that we do have to have these specialized spaces. And it's not that we're trying to segment ourselves away, but it's understanding that there is a deep, deep trauma that requires sensitivity, that requires a lot of attention, or else what I see from my perspective is a lot of these queer Asian folks just bottle it up. They either bottle it up for their entire lives, never embracing their true queer identity, or they assimilate, right? They assimilate with white culture so that they can survive. And so I think these specialized spaces is really to help unravel them. And as far as the work that I do, I host support groups for queer Asians once a month. And a lot of the conversation is really just on these rudimentary aspects of growth, just being able to come into one's own, and how scared they are to even have that space to do so. Because also layered on top, right, we have this Asian culture that is so, it's so, how do you say, it's like honorable, but not honorable, but it's like so stoic. There we go. So stoic. And just being vulnerable, it's just so scary for the Asian, for the queer Asian especially. And Yeah, it's the more we can create these spaces, the more we can really open up and move our community forward.
Because, shame and failure, and weakness has always been used in our communities. So, as Brené Brown has said, vulnerability has always been seen with weakness, but it's about being brave. And it took me a long time to realize that to be brave, I had to be vulnerable, and I had to peel off my onion skin and show my true self. And, that's what lacks within the LGBTQ community, particularly in the West, is a space where Asian queer people can come together and we can just be. We don't have to justify ourselves in the space, and we constantly have to do that in, particularly in white spaces and in LGBTQ spaces.
Absolutely. And I just want to go to this aspect that you had touched that I think is such an important aspect of just the queer conversation overall, is this aspect about body and how we see ourselves. And a former life that I had was being a part of the circuit community. And that community is just so centered around the Adonis body, queer men gathering together that look a specific way. And when I look just at the gay community as a whole, there is a lot of body shaming, body dysmorphia, queer men who it's not even that they're fat, it's just they don't have a ripped six-pack or gigantic pecs and huge arms aren't accepted. They go on Grindr, they go on these dating apps, and there's so much fat shaming, or not even fat, normal shaming. And it's been a very eye-opening part of my experience as well, coming from being in this community where I thought that this was normal, and then stepping away from it, looking from the outside in, now I go, oh, wow, this is very hurtful. This is very damaging to folks. And I was just curious, from your perspective, how do we improve this? How do we help our community accept more than just the beautiful sculpted bodies, but understand that anybody is normal, should be loved?
When I think about that, I think about myself and how as a child I hated myself and I hated my body. I hated being Asian and I hated being part of the LGBTQ community. And I feel that for a lot of LGBTQ people, regardless of race or religion or anything, is that society has always made us feel unworthy and unloved and worthless and not enough. And what's the one thing that we can control is our body. So we're always striving to fit in and try to be perfect. And if I have the six-pack, well, I'm still not enough. I need an 8-pack. I need a 12-pack. And to the point where I can't even see what's before me. And it's coming through our own insecurities of all those years as a child and as a teen, with our community and our family and mass media constantly shaming who we are as LGBTQ people, and that we're not worthy and we'll never be loved and we will never be enough. And, we need to have more conversations around that as children. I mean, I think what's happened in Scotland now has become the first country in the world to now have LGBTQ history in the school system.
Mm-hmm, yes.
And how amazing that is, that little kids will now hear positive stories about LGBTQ people in history, because that's where it starts, when we're a little kids and we're trying to work out these strange feelings that we don't know how to put our finger on, of why we feel, like we're in the wrong body because of our gender identity or something to do with our sexuality, and at the same time society telling that this is wrong and we will never be loved. And, you know, we have to have LGBTQ education as children. We have to have the power of storytelling to make us feel good. And how powerful, I mean, when you think about yourself at 6, how powerful it would have been if an Asian person at our age came into that classroom and shared their story and shared their success and shared how much they embraced and loved who they were and how that would make you feel.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And when you feel good about yourself, you also then feel physically good about yourself. You stop worrying that you need this 12-pack to somehow fit in, to somehow feel worthy, because you've had these positive images as a child that being LGBTQ is something to be loved and embraced, and that you're enough just as you are. I mean, but it's like, you all, what do we do with this adult population that's our age that didn't get that and that is still going through that? Then we have to create spaces where we can be vulnerable, and that's okay. Like the work that you do around having Asian queer support spaces, and I think, you know, we need to have more of those spaces. And I think, you know, we have these very when people say toxic masculinity, I think, no, it's toxic gender norms of what a man should be and what a woman should be. Like, men are told from the very moment that they're born that they need to man up, don't cry,
have balls,
have balls, showing feelings are weak. So you've grown up all these years and now you're an adult and you've suppressed all your emotions. You can't even shed a tear without thinking that's some form of weakness. So we have to teach not just, you know, LGBTQ history and have storytelling, but we also have to think differently about our education around children, about emotional intelligence and giving children that space to be who they are. Because you look at women of, you know, we're allowed, because our gender norm is that we're allowed to cry in public. It's okay for girls to cry. It's okay if, you know, when we have a bad day, we ring up our girlfriend and we all huddle together and have a good cry, and then we feel better from it. You know, there's no illusion why that all the mass shootings that you see across the US are all done by men. You know, a woman, if she's in that situation, in her mind, she will call her friends. So, you know, there's a lot of, we really have to look at our education system. It really comes down to that in terms of, you know, why there's this generation of LGBTQ community the way that they are. And I think, you know, with what's happening in Scotland, with now that kind of education in the school system, if we look 20 years ahead, I'm sure those kids will feel very differently about themselves, knowing that they have had that kind of education as a child compared to kids that haven't.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I wholeheartedly agree with you, bringing or dismantling these gender norms. And when you were talking just about education, I also thought about education of heroes, right? Who we have as heroes, and the narrative that we build around them fits so, just are so intertwined with gender norms. You have these men who are these leaders of wars, these leaders of masculine movements, right? And then you have the feminine side, which is like Mother Teresa, right? For example, it's Mother Teresa versus MLK. And I think what we can also do is talk about how MLK, Martin Luther King, also had a feminine energy to him. And what does that look like? And then for Mother Teresa, she did have a masculine energy, how she was very great at business negotiations and very tactical, strategic minded thinking of how to bring equity into the world, you know.
But
And
we never
yes,
hear that. And
absolutely.
I think what is really missing within, the Asian community, when I think of Asian American history, we don't even have a museum. If, right now we're lobbying for a national Asian American museum, and, we don't learn about our history. And when we look back in history, we had amazing Asian American leaders, men and women who are at the forefront, but we don't learn about it. So there's also that missing link for Asian kids to know our own heroes and to know who came before us, because Black kids, they see Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. They know they stood on the shoulders of giants. But for an Asian kid, if you ask them, they would have no clue. And we also have an Asian queer history that needs to be taught. So I think, that's so important, because we also led the civil rights movement. So there's a huge gap in our learning as Asian people that, even me as an adult, I'm just learning about all of this, and I'm thinking how that would have helped me as a kid if I knew all these amazing Asian heroes. And you're so right in terms of the gender norm, because when we think of heroes, they're always whites, men. When you think of Superman, he has a six-pack, he's physically strong, he's physically perfect.
Yeah. Perfect chiseled face, it's absolutely. The more we can dismantle just even our perception of what is a hero, I think will really redefine the way that everybody in the community will start to identify themselves. And the one thing that I really absolutely think is so important to call out is this history that you have with homelessness and why it's so important, especially for the queer community. And I had worked with LGBTQ youth back when I was in San Diego, and the amount of youth that were getting thrown out into the streets, and people don't realize, but San Diego is a very Republican red area. They think it's so, it's so beachy, so, democratic, but that is not the case. And these kids, 16, 17, 18, so many 18-year-olds were getting put out into the streets to just fend for themselves. And they would come into the center looking for community. And it was just so heartbreaking sometimes when they weren't able to get housing. There's this whole application process to even be considered a part of youth housing, and there's not enough spots, and you have to be on a wait list. And if you don't make the wait list, then good luck, go fend for yourself until you get off the wait list. And it is just so, especially not even just for gay and lesbian kids, but especially for trans kids. And it was just so it was a huge rude awakening for me, and also acknowledging the privilege that I had, not having to deal with that, and in the work that I do as well, just acknowledging that we do have to make a space for it. And the question I have for you is, especially as someone who has gone through that experience, what message do you have that could be of advice for those who maybe don't think too much about this, about homelessness and about homelessness as it pertains to LGBTQ youth?
The LGBTQ youth sector is only 3 to 5% of the entire youth community, but 40 to 50% of LGBTQ youth are made homeless. And because youth are coming out earlier, they're being made homeless at the age of 10. And absolutely, trans youth, are even more vulnerable. And, for the most part, it's invisible. When we see homeless people in the street, it's usually like an old, adult men. So LGBTQ youth, we don't see that 15-year-old because they're probably hiding or clustering together because for them, it's very unsafe when you're living on the streets. And we can end homelessness. We we can end hunger, but we aren't, and we have done such a disservice for LGBTQ youth. Because yes, I realize there are so many, we wanted marriage equality, and absolutely we need anti-discrimination laws, but LGBTQ youth, we need to help them. These, when I think of the work that I'm doing now, I'm not doing it for me, I'm doing it for the next generation. This is not, the seat that I'm in, I'm borrowing it from the next generation. These are the next generation of kids who are struggling in the street and struggling to survive. I mean, the funding has been cut because, homeless LGBTQ youth is not sexy, is it? In terms of sponsorship, it's not like marriage equality that sounds much more exciting and it's more inclusive of the entire community. This is just one small section of the community. And once again, there is a tremendous amount of white privilege within the LGBTQ community, and many of those LGBTQ kids that are made homeless are not white. So if it's not happening to me, why should I would look the other way. And many of the major organizations are run by white men in
most
are run by white men in privilege who have never experienced, what it's like to be on the margins of society. I mean, when I was homeless, it was my darkest years. And I think now with the pandemic, how challenging it is for us all. But it's like, imagine being homeless and having a pandemic. It's like the worst kind of double whammy ever. And when I was homeless, just constantly suicidal, severe mental health, feeling like you're just absolutely nothing in this world. And every day is a struggle. I mean, I remember just sleeping on days on end because your body is just so exhausted trying to survive, trying to cope with your mental health. We need many more programs that support LGBTQ youth in terms of obviously through the education system to programs that provide LGBTQ homeless youth with unique skills and fast track to career path development. I mean, what I piloted in Vietnam a couple of years ago was, I wrote a program that I wanted where I could be celebrated, loved, acknowledged, where I could meet leaders of the world and have this fast track at the end to some kind of career path development. So it was the first kind of leadership, sports, business and education program in Asia that I piloted in my home country that looked at, gathering homeless LGBTQ youth and providing them very unique skills through leadership, sports and business, and then having corporate partners and other organizations that would pledge to then provide higher education, internship and programs. And yes, that we do have some programs like that, but not enough. And I think very differently. I think because I've traveled the world and I built a phenomenal network from governments down to business leaders. And I found out that, many business leaders, they want to support these youth, but don't know how because the kids have broken education. A lot of states across the US just don't have the funding for this kind of program. So it kind of falls flat. And, for the most part, all the kids are coming from the red states, from the South, and they head either to the West Coast or the East Coast thinking that there's something for them there. But when they get there, there's nothing there. And it's so heartbreaking because by that stage, they're trapped and they can't go back and they're just living day to day. And, there are very few beds. So you're fighting for, a handful of beds, you're suffering from, severe mental health and maybe drug addiction and alcoholism and other things that you have to deal with. And, it's tough work. It's not sexy work either. And and so that's why a lot of people don't want to get involved with this kind of programming, because it's really lifelong programming. But for me, I've come through that. So I know what it's like to be homeless. I know what it's like to live on the margins, to go through all of that. And I know how this kind of program would really help a youth, because I think that, I realize I can't help everyone in the world, and it's not about numbers, but it's about helping just a few people, because it will change their life forever. And then when you think about the transgender community, I mean, I was the first to give out educational scholarships to transgender youth experiencing homelessness in Vietnam. And for me, it was that easy. It's like, you have some money and you give it to the college or the, higher education college, and they're able to get educated and they're able to, lift themselves out of poverty. And we're doing, and we've chosen a pandemic to roll back trans rights around the world, and I think we're up to now something like 20 deaths of Black trans women in the US. We've done such a disservice in terms of not supporting the trans community enough, and the anti-LGBT laws that have been passed, particularly the one in Idaho that means that trans kids can't even play sports, and what that means to a kid, where that's what they love and what sports does for an LGBTQ person. There's just so much more work that we need to do, but governments need to prioritize. And it's unfortunate we don't have an administration that prioritizes the LGBTQ community like the Obama administration did. But also states, states need to give more funding, because for the most part, a lot of LGBTQ shelters struggle with funds, and they get to a point where they're really just surviving just with the temporary shelter that they have, that there may not be enough programming to provide transitional programming after that. So there's always that kind of falling short between getting into housing and then transitioning out into employment. And companies, they don't have the structure to build programs. They just want to go into an already made program.
Yeah. For anyone who's listening who may be either homeless, struggling with it, or know people who are struggling with it, what are your recommendations of what they should do, especially for yourself who has been able to get out of it?
Try and find support network is so important. If you can get access to someone's phone, and if you need someone to speak to, there's the Trevor project, because sometimes it's just reaching out to a hotline, particularly if you're struggling with your mental health, or if you're feeling like you just can't go on anymore. I think that finding, it is very difficult, because I can say find a support network, but if you're homeless and you don't have access to a phone, it's like, well, how do I find a support network? And a lot of cities do have soup kitchens, or places where you can get a free meal. If you have access to the internet, there's a lot of support you can find on the internet. I think the internet's your friend. There are so many support groups on the internet, listening to a podcast like yours, because just hearing stories of other LGBTQ people, other Asian LGBTQ people who have gone through the same experience as you but come out of it the other side. Because I think the most important thing is knowing that there's a sense of hope, because when you're feeling very hopeless, you want to know that there's some hope and that there's a light at the end of the tunnel there. I think most cities have some kind of, LGBTQ center or LGBTQ resource. And if not, I would say, call an organization like the Trevor Project, because they would also have a lot of resources that you can have at hand. But I think as well, the most important thing is to know that you are loved and to know that you're a part of a larger community that loves and celebrates you, and that you're enough, and that you've always been enough, and that there are people like me who have gone through exactly what you have gone through or going through now, and that I'm there fighting on your behalf. I mean, the program that I piloted in Vietnam, I plan to launch in the US next year. First in Atlanta, to be able to serve homeless LGBTQ youth in the South, but then I hope to develop a scholarship program that will become national, so I can support as many kids as possible across the US, and then eventually, an international program, and just to be able to educate the community along the way, because there's enough money in the business community and in society, and one billionaire alone could help end this crisis that we have. And the question that we have to keep asking ourselves is, why not? Why we not? Just like helping transgender people, we can create programming that would lift trans women, particularly, Black trans women who are the most persecuted in the community and suffer the most in terms of the high rate of deaths. And a lot of it comes down to education. I mean, a lot of the work that I do now is about particularly educating business leaders of what it is to be Asian and what it is to be LGBTQ in the workplace, and the challenges and barriers that we face, because we do face very unique challenges. We're least likely to come forward, and we're most likely to hide, who we are for the rest of our lives. And we're bullied the most out of all, ethnic groups. So I think the power of storytelling is so powerful. So I share my story as much as I can and do as much work as I can with business leaders. And I do a lot of work with governments all around the world of how they can use sport as a platform for equality, and how they need to champion LGBTQ equality in their country, because how that will lift their people out of poverty in the situations that they have by making a more equal society. Because until we share our stories, people don't know the pain that we have inside. And particularly for Asian LGBTQ people, because we hide our pain so well. I mean, it's kind of, I was reading one study in the US that Asian college youth have one of the highest rates of contemplating suicide, more than any other ethnic racial group or, white student. And, we are bullied the most, and our bullying is so layered, within our multiple identities that intersect to make us whole.
Yeah. And, speaking our truth and telling our stories is just so beneficial for our larger collective community, especially the queer Asian community. And recently, this past Pride season, you had worked with the Advocate, highlighting other Asian LGBTQ voices on the Instagram Live series. And I wanted to ask you, what lessons did you learn for them? Is there any that were your favorites? Any takeaways?
For me, I've always wanted to do something like this, to be able to give our community a platform, because we're usually never given this kind of platform where Asian LGBTQ people can speak to each other, and the world can be invited into our conversations and our stories. I learned from Hollywood actor Leonardo Nam, who's a good friend of mine, he's on the Westworld, that, he lived in Australia, in Sydney as well, that we shared the same experience of, the racism and bullying that we received, and growing up, feeling different, and our sexuality, and thinking that we lived in the same city. And we both thought that we were the only kids, but realizing that,
just
all these
separated.
years, I know, and all these years later, coming together as friends and sharing that story, and how powerful it was, like sharing it to each other and thinking, oh my God, there was like another Asian person in the same city that lived near me, experiencing exactly the same thing at the time that I was experiencing it. So that was, amazing. I mean, I loved all the interviews, for the conversations that I had, for very different, reasons, with Leo Shen, with Rain, Valdez, BD Wong and Jack Choi, because I had never experienced this growing up, being able to have these discussions with other Asian LGBTQ people, and realizing that our stories are different, but we share the same similar experience. I mean, I feel that, besides Leonardo, because obviously we grew up in the same country, Jake Choi's story really resonated with me, because he came from sports into the entertainment industry, and just his story was so powerful. I mean, I remember when he did that speech at the Human Rights Campaign dinner, and crying at the end, and it's like, we don't see, as Asian LGBTQ people, we don't see those powerful, vulnerable stories where you can feel the pain of that child within the adult, and it's so real that it still brings you to tears. Because, and I remember swelling up in tears thinking about it, and even now when I think about it, because you think, that's my story, and that's exactly how I felt growing up, and I'm seeing that for the first time. And we had such an overwhelming response from the Pride series that we did, and we had so many people logging on, because I think for the most part there were so many Asian people that logged on for the first time and heard their stories, and the power of seeing two Asian LGBTQ people sharing their stories, and then people that weren't part of our community really being able to listen in on what it is to be Asian and LGBTQ, and really understanding for the first time the challenges and barriers that we face, and the trauma that we have within us, and what it is to be part of our community. So there was so much power in that, and I want to continue these kinds of conversations, because I feel that there has been a shift. Obviously with COVID, we had this anti-Asian racism that spread across the world, and we never knew this was going to happen. I mean, it's been so bad across the US, but every country it's been bad, but particularly in the US. And I think for the first time we're seen. We really felt like, as a community, that people now see us, because there was always anti-Asian sentiment towards our community, but for the first time you saw it en masse, and you heard our stories en masse on a global scale. We felt brave enough and vulnerable enough to share our stories, because we saw other people sharing their stories, which meant it was okay for us to finally share our stories. So I feel the Asian community is having a moment, and we've unified in a way like we haven't seen either. And I think moving forward and out of, COVID, we're going to be a different community. And I feel that now, as a community, we want this voice, and we want to be seen more than ever in the community. And we're not settling for second best anymore. And we're not settling for being the butt of jokes that we have been for so long within media. And I'm seeing now, a shift. I mean, when I watched the L Word and saw Leo, and I thought, wow, the previous L Word, there were no Asian faces. And, suddenly we're seeing so many more. And when I think of people like Chantal Tui on Black Lightning, who plays a bisexual superhero who's in an interracial relationship with the main character. And I think how powerful that must be for an Asian queer kid seeing that for the first time and thinking that I'm Asian and I'm queer and I'm a superhero, and what that means.
It's amazing. And I'm just so honored that you were able to create that space with The Advocate and get this to all of their readers. And I have also worked with some of these magazine publications, and when you actually, what's crazy was when I actually did a search on their website, just searching the word Asian, the number of articles that had Asians were so few. It was just so mind-boggling. And I think the more that we can create these spaces, not only helps the community, the queer Asian community or the larger Asian community, but it helps these magazines too in terms of the content, creating a more diverse, a more equitable environment. And I think the more we can partner with these organizations to create these spaces really is the way forward, that we're going to be able to help the next queer Asian the queer Asian child to feel heard, feel seen, so that when they come of age, they're not just dealing with, figuring out their queer identity, but then they take it the next level further, even beyond us. What do they do with it now? And that's what's really exciting for me is, just imagining, where is this next generation going to take this movement, our stories, and how do we help elevate and grow this collective consciousness. Amazing.
Absolutely. And I think the same as well, because, for a very long time within LGBTQ media, there was no Asian representation. We just weren't given these platforms. We weren't talked about. We just weren't seen as relevant. And I've had to work very hard to create these spaces. And it surprised myself when I started on this journey to advocacy some years ago, how little we were seen in the press, and how I thought how easy it would be to create these platforms, and how difficult it was when I started speaking to the LGBTQ media and organizations. They just didn't see us as relevant. And I used to always think, it's not like you have hundreds of LGBTQ Asian people coming to you. It's like one of one, if that. And I think, it's just through this perseverance, because I keep thinking about myself. And, this is the reason I do the work that I do, because I remember what it was like for me as a child when I never saw myself, and how it made me feel for so many years. And and I have to keep remembering, when I share my story a million times, it's not for me, it's for that person who hears it for the first time and thinks, that's my story and that's me. And how that makes them feel for the first time, seeing themselves and knowing that in that moment they're going to be okay.
Yes, so beautiful. And so that takes us to the end of our podcast episode. It was so amazing just to sit down and talk about your life, your accomplishments, what you're working on. And my next question is just, what's next for you? What are you headed off to do next, work on as a project? So
besides launching this youth project in the US next year, I do a lot of, obviously because sports is my background, so I do a lot of work with governments around using sport as a platform for equality. So we're in a very interesting time. And for a very long time, I've been speaking to people around, the lack of Asian representation in professional sports, the fact that we have so few Asian LGBTQ people, you can count them on one hand in the West, if that, and in some countries there's, zero representation, and what that means in society. But now we're in a very unique time where all the major sports events in the world will be in Asia over the next few years. So all the work that I'm doing around sports is leading up to those conversations around Tokyo 2021. Obviously in 2022, we have the Commonwealth Games, the Beijing Olympics, Gay Games, and World Cup in Qatar. So with the UK governments, I'm leading on sports equality around conversations around Tokyo 2021 and Beijing 2022. And, it's like, what are these conversations, that I can have with different governments around the world, and the events that I will have in Asia and in the US and in other parts of the world, because sport is a slice of life. And, the amount of, and I always use Jeremy Lin as a perfect example, that he's one of the top basketball players in the world, but the amount of racism that he received in the US and how the media spun the racism. I remember seeing an article, I think it was like the missing chink in the armor, and, that they led constantly on his ethnicity and the racism, and then what that means to an Asian kid who is thinking of stepping into sports for the first time, but sees that and thinks, I'm not going to. So for me, these conversations are, and I always think when I have, the work that I do is quite unique because I do so much work with governments all around the world, from the UK government to the Argentina government, New Zealand, Australian, Mexican government, most of the major governments and Asian governments, because I think that when you're having decisions, you have to have the decision makers in the room. So I always make sure I have governments in the room, business leaders in the room, and community leaders. So I'm now looking at working towards the conversations I can have up to Tokyo 2021. I will go to Tokyo when it's on as well, because we're in an important moment in history where all eyes are on Asia. And, it's our time to shine. And Asia is shifting in terms of how it's seeing equality. But that also means a shift for Asians in the West, because, to have more out Asian LGBTQ athletes, we have to have more Asian more Asian athletes. And, we have to create these safe and nurturing environments where Asian kids can thrive through sports and not go through what I feel like, when you're just kind of bullied constantly and discriminated, and what that means, then how that trickles down into society. So that's a lot of work that I'm doing around that. And then I have some more interesting projects that I'll be kind of unveiling over the next few months this year as well.
Yeah. How can our listeners find you? How can they best discover you online?
So they can go to my website, AmazinLethi.com. I am the only Amazin Lêthi on the internet, so it's quite easy to find me. And then all my social media is at Amazin Lêthi. So you can find me, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And before we go, any last words? Anything that you want to leave off with?
I hope that by sharing my story, that whoever's listening to this, that they too can be openly out in sports and life. And that if you never want to come out, that's okay. But just to be happy within yourself, that, and I can never say this enough, that, the feelings inside you have, are worthy, and that the space that you own is yours to own, and that, you're loved and celebrated for who you are by a wider Asian LGBTQ community. Even though you may not feel that you're part of it now, know that there are people like myself that love and celebrate and support you, and that you're enough, and that you've always been enough. And I think for so many Asian LGBTQ people, we've always felt like we were never enough and never worthy of owning the space that we are in. And it takes us so long to get to that point. And I remember it took so long in myself to realize that, within myself. And, I want people to be able to get to that faster. And I want people to know that, they're enough right away, and that it's okay. And to have all these multiple intersecting feelings and identities, that's okay. And that makes you whole as well.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful message. Thank you so much for this podcast. It was so amazing just to hear your story and your words of wisdom. It's just so nourishing, and I just feel so seen, so heard, and just so grateful that you've taken the time today to show up on this podcast.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. It's been such a pleasure to share this space with you, and to share my story, and to speak to your listeners. And, it's what you're doing is so important, because, I never had a podcast like this when I was a child. And I know how meaningful it is, particularly for Asian queer people in, parts of rural America and, around the world, who feel like they're the only Asian LGBTQ person in the world and don't feel connected to the community, where this becomes a lifeline to the Asian queer community, where they can sit in this space and hear their stories and be seen and be validated, and know that they're enough and parts of a wider community that loves and celebrates just as them as they are.
Thank you. And for all you listeners, thank you so much for listening, and really appreciate you taking the time. No, time is very valuable, and hope you got a lot out of this episode. And so with that, we wish you well and hope your day can be a little bit more mindful. Bye now.
Bye everyone. Thank you for listening.